Can she even read French? Victoria Whitmore laughed loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, lifting the leather-bound menu with manicured fingers while the soft glow of crystal chandeliers shimmered above her diamond bracelet. A few guests chuckled into their wine glasses. Others looked away awkwardly. Claire Bennett stood beside the table without moving, her small notepad resting against the palm of her hand. The white cloth draped over her arm was perfectly folded. Calm. Precise. Almost too calm for someone being humiliated in the middle of Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and silver. Inside Le Claremont, everything smelled of butter, expensive perfume, and quiet judgment. Ethan Whitmore leaned back in his chair, loosening the cuff of his tailored navy jacket with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never once worried about money. "Honey," he said with an amused grin, "don't be cruel. I'm sure she took at least one semester of French somewhere." More laughter followed. Claire lowered her eyes politely. "Would you like another bottle of Bordeaux, sir?" Her voice remained soft, professional. That seemed to irritate Victoria even more. "Actually," Victoria interrupted, pointing at a line on the menu, "why don't you pronounce this for us?" Claire glanced down at the page. Boeuf bourguignon. A simple dish. 2 words she could have spoken flawlessly in less than a second. But instead, she paused, just long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable. "I apologize," she said quietly. "French pronunciation was never my specialty." Victoria smirked triumphantly and exchanged a look with Ethan. "See? I told you." A businessman at the neighboring table shook his head slightly before returning to his dinner. Claire wrote something onto her pad with neat handwriting and stepped back. Around her, silverware clinked against porcelain. Waiters moved carefully beneath warm amber lights. A pianist in the corner played a slow jazz melody almost drowned out by conversation and rain. But Claire heard everything. Every whisper. Every laugh. Every careless assumption hidden beneath polished manners. She had learned years ago that wealthy people often mistook silence for weakness. And tonight, she let them. "You know what's funny?" Victoria continued, swirling red wine inside her crystal glass. "Places like this pretend to be authentic, but half the staff probably can't even point to France on a map." Ethan chuckled under his breath. "That's New York for you." Claire nodded once as if she hadn't heard a word, but her fingers tightened slightly around the pen in her hand. Just slightly. Then the front doors opened. Cold air swept through the restaurant as several heads turned at once. A tall older man entered beneath the golden lights, removing dark leather gloves with slow elegance while a younger woman followed beside him in a cream-colored coat. The maitre d' nearly rushed forward. "Monsieur Laurent," he said nervously. "Welcome back to Le Claremont." Even Ethan straightened in his chair. Everyone in Manhattan's finance world knew the name Daniel Laurent. French billionaire. Luxury empire owner. One of the most difficult men in international business. And tonight, he was supposed to finalize a partnership worth nearly $400 million. Claire noticed something else immediately. The translator wasn't with him. The manager noticed too. His face lost color instantly. He whispered something urgently to another employee before hurrying toward the kitchen. Ethan muttered under his breath, "You've got to be kidding me." Victoria blinked. "What happened?" "Their translator's missing." Ethan's jaw tightened as Daniel Laurent sat only 2 tables away. "And if this meeting goes badly, the deal dies tonight." Claire quietly reached for Ethan's empty wine glass. "Would you like me to refill that for you, sir?" Ethan barely looked at her. His attention remained fixed on the billionaire across the room. "No," he said distractedly. "Just stay nearby." Claire gave a small nod. Then, for the first time that evening, the faintest shadow of something unreadable passed behind her blue eyes as thunder rolled softly beyond the rain-covered windows. The atmosphere inside Le Claremont shifted. Almost instantly after Daniel Laurent arrived, conversations softened. Forks slowed against porcelain plates. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to lower the tempo of the music without being asked. That was the effect powerful men had on rooms. They bent the air around them. Ethan Whitmore stood as Daniel approached his table, extending a confident hand with the polished smile of someone accustomed to closing impossible deals. "Monsieur Laurent," he said carefully, "it is an honor to finally meet you in person." Daniel shook his hand once, reserved and unreadable. His silver hair reflected the chandelier light like brushed steel. Beside him, his daughter Camille Laurent observed the room quietly with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. Ethan gestured toward the empty seat at his table. "Please, join us." Victoria immediately straightened her posture and flashed a dazzling socialite smile. "We have heard so much about your company." Daniel responded politely, but his attention drifted toward the entrance every few seconds. Waiting. Looking irritated now, Ethan noticed. "Your translator is running late?" Daniel exhaled slowly. Apparently stranded downtown because of the storm. His French accent carried elegance even through annoyance. A very unfortunate inconvenience. Ethan forced a confident laugh. "No problem at all. I speak enough French for business." Claire heard that while placing fresh candles near the window. She did not react outwardly. But Camille Laurent glanced toward Ethan with immediate skepticism. Daniel slowly sat down. "Very well," he replied. "Then perhaps we begin." Claire stepped away quietly as another waiter delivered wine to the table. Rain continued streaking down the tall windows behind them, while distant thunder rolled over Manhattan like a warning too far away to matter. Ethan loosened his shoulders and leaned into the negotiation with controlled confidence. "Nous sommes très excités pour cette opportunité," he began. The pronunciation was rough, uneven. Camille lowered her eyes slightly. Victoria smiled proudly anyway, clearly unable to tell the difference. Daniel remained polite, though something colder entered his expression. Ethan continued speaking, mixing English with fractured French phrases learned for meetings exactly like this. At first, the mistakes were harmless. Articles misplaced. Verb endings awkward. But then came the sentence that changed the room. "We look forward to controlling your European distribution structure completely," Ethan declared in English before attempting the same statement in French. Claire froze near the service station. So did Camille. Because the word Ethan chose did not mean partnership. It meant ownership. Daniel Laurent's face hardened instantly. The warmth vanished from his eyes. Camille slowly placed her wine glass down onto the white tablecloth. "I beg your pardon?" Daniel asked quietly. Ethan blinked, unaware. "Our firms together will dominate the market," he continued. "Naturally, operational authority would transfer to our New York office." Victoria nodded enthusiastically beside him, as if he had just delivered something brilliant. But Daniel leaned back in silence now. Dangerous silence. The kind wealthy men used before walking away forever. Claire watched Ethan smile confidently, while unknowingly destroying his own deal one sentence at a time. Around the restaurant, tension spread subtly from table to table. Staff exchanged nervous glances. The manager stood near the kitchen entrance gripping a tablet, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ethan finally sensed something was wrong. "Did I say something incorrect?" Daniel's voice became colder than the rain outside. "Monsieur Whitmore, my company is not for sale." Ethan frowned immediately. No, that is not what I meant." Camille interjected softly. "Actually, that is exactly what you said." Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "I think there is simply a misunderstanding." Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. "There is no misunderstanding. There is arrogance." Silence crashed over the table. Even nearby diners stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan opened his mouth again, but this time uncertainty finally appeared behind his confident expression. Because for the first time all evening, he realized he no longer understood the conversation happening in front of him. Claire took one slow breath behind the service station. Then another. She looked toward the rain outside, toward the reflection of chandelier light against dark glass, toward the table where humiliation was beginning to bloom across Ethan Whitmore's face exactly the way it had bloomed across hers less than an hour earlier. Her fingers tightened around the folded white cloth draped over her arm. Then she walked forward quietly between the tables, calm, almost invisible, until she stopped beside Daniel Laurent and spoke in perfect French. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." He was trying to express strategic partnership, not ownership. The wording was incorrect. The entire restaurant went still, completely still. Ethan turned toward her, so quickly his chair scraped against the marble floor. Victoria stared openly. Daniel Laurent's eyes narrowed with surprise as Claire continued speaking, her accent smooth and elegant, carrying the effortless rhythm of someone who had not memorized the language but lived inside it once. "Monsieur Whitmore admires your European structure," she explained gently. He intended to say your leadership was essential to the partnership's success. Camille Laurent slowly blinked, then looked at Claire with sudden recognition that she could not yet explain. And across the table, Ethan Whitmore forgot to breathe for a moment because the quiet waitress he had mocked less than an hour earlier no longer sounded like a waitress at all. For several long seconds, nobody in Le Clermont moved. The rain outside continued whispering against the glass, but inside the restaurant, even the sound of silverware had disappeared. Claire Bennett stood beside the table with quiet composure, one hand lightly resting against the folded white cloth over her arm as flawless French flowed from her lips with effortless precision. Not rehearsed, not academic, natural, alive. Daniel Laurent's expression softened almost immediately. The tension that had hardened his features moments earlier slowly dissolved as Claire clarified Ethan Whitmore's disastrous phrasing with elegant diplomacy. She did not embarrass Ethan. That was the part nobody expected. She could have, easily. Instead, she protected him while making it seem graceful. Camille Laurent watched Claire carefully now, studying her face as though trying to pull a memory from years ago. Ethan remained frozen beside the table, stunned by the transformation happening in front of him. The shy waitress with the plain black uniform suddenly carried herself differently under the chandelier light. Not higher, not louder, just impossible to overlook now. Daniel finally spoke again in French, slower this time, testing her. You understand business terminology well for someone working in a restaurant. Claire answered with calm humility. Languages require context, monsieur, especially in negotiations. Daniel gave a faint nod. Approval. Real approval. Victoria sat perfectly still beside Ethan, gripping the stem of her wine glass too tightly. Her confident smile had vanished completely. Claire continued translating as the conversation resumed, moving seamlessly between English and French with remarkable control. But more importantly, she understood tone, nuance, culture. When Daniel used a phrase layered with subtle skepticism, Claire softened it before translating. When Ethan accidentally sounded too aggressive again, Claire adjusted his wording without making him appear weak. She was not simply translating sentences. She was rescuing the room itself. Ethan noticed it too. Every time Claire spoke, Daniel relaxed slightly. Every time Ethan spoke alone, tension returned. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Where exactly did you learn French? Camille finally asked during a pause in the discussion. Claire hesitated only briefly. I lived in Lyon for a few years. Camille's eyes widened slightly. Lyon. Claire nodded once. Near Place Belcourt. Something flickered across Camille's face then. Recognition. Real recognition. Wait. She leaned forward slowly. There was a national language competition there about 7 years ago. Claire's fingers tightened subtly around the cloth in her hand. Ethan noticed. You were there, Camille said quietly. You won first place. Claire lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. That was a long time ago. Daniel turned toward his daughter with surprise. You know her? Camille looked almost offended by the question. Father, everyone there knew her. She stared at Claire in disbelief now. Claire Bennett, the American girl who spoke 4 languages without notes. Silence returned to the table again. Different this time. Heavier. Ethan slowly looked up at Claire as though seeing an entirely different person standing beside him. Victoria blinked repeatedly, struggling to reconcile the elegant multilingual woman before her with the waitress she had mocked less than an hour earlier. Claire gave a small, polite smile. People move on. But Camille shook her head immediately. No, not people like you. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle uncomfortably in his chest. Shame, sharp and quiet, because suddenly he remembered every careless joke from earlier that evening. Every laugh, every assumption. And Claire had endured all of it while knowing more than anyone else in the room. Daniel leaned back in his chair, observing Claire carefully now. Why would someone with your abilities work here? The question was not cruel, just genuine. Claire answered softly while adjusting an empty water glass near the edge of the table. Life rarely follows the plan we make for it. Ethan noticed the way she avoided specifics. Not defensive, just private. The kind of privacy built from surviving disappointment without asking anyone for pity. Daniel respected that instantly. Still, he said quietly, talent like yours belongs in larger rooms than this one. Claire looked around the restaurant. The golden lights. The rain-streaked windows. The tired servers carrying trays through crowded aisles. Perhaps, she replied. But dignity does not depend on the room. Daniel Laurent smiled faintly at that. The first real smile he had shown all evening. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the untouched wine in front of him. Earlier, he had laughed because he believed Claire Bennett was beneath him. Now he was beginning to realize something deeply uncomfortable. She had been the most educated person at the table the entire night, and she never once needed to announce it. Near the kitchen entrance, the restaurant manager finally exhaled in relief after watching the negotiation stabilize again. Around the dining room, whispers quietly spread between tables. Customers who had ignored Claire all evening now watched her every movement differently. Not because she demanded attention, because she never tried to. Claire translated another sentence smoothly for Daniel before stepping back slightly into the warm glow of the restaurant lights. Calm again, quiet again, but nothing in Le Claremont felt the same anymore. The negotiation continued for nearly another hour beneath the warm chandelier light, but the balance inside the room had completely changed now. Daniel Laurent no longer directed his attention toward Ethan Whitmore first. He looked at Claire, asked questions through Claire, waited for her responses before continuing. And every single time she spoke French, the restaurant seemed to grow quieter around her. Ethan noticed it in the smallest details. The way nearby diners subtly paused their conversations whenever Claire translated. The way Camille Laurent watched her with open admiration now instead of curiosity. Even the servers passing through the dining room moved more carefully around the table, as though something rare was unfolding in front of them, and nobody wanted to interrupt it. Claire herself seemed unaware of any of it, or perhaps she simply refused to acknowledge it. She continued pouring water, adjusting silverware, clearing plates with the same calm precision as before. The only difference was that now, everyone was paying attention. Your understanding of cultural phrasing is impressive, Daniel said after Claire carefully reworded another delicate financial point. Most translators focus only on words. Claire offered a small polite smile. Words are usually the easiest part. Daniel nodded slowly as though that answer confirmed something important about her. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Claire with increasing confusion. He had spent years surrounding himself with elite consultants, Ivy League analysts, international advisors. People who constantly reminded the room how intelligent they were. But Claire Bennett carried knowledge differently. Quietly. Without performance. Without ego. And somehow that made it feel more powerful. Victoria, meanwhile, had become unusually silent. Earlier in the evening, she had controlled the atmosphere effortlessly with jokes and confidence. Now she barely touched her wine. Every time Claire spoke French, Victoria's posture stiffened slightly, as though each elegant sentence reminded her of the humiliation she had brought onto herself. Camille eventually broke the silence. "You disappeared after Lion," she said softly while folding her hands together on the table. "Several universities wanted you." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "Things changed. You could have worked anywhere." Claire adjusted an empty bread plate before answering. "Sometimes family matters more than ambition." Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her voice when she said it. Not bitterness, just truth. Daniel studied her carefully. "Your parents." Claire shook her head once. "My mother became ill during my final year overseas." A pause followed. Soft. Heavy. "Medical treatment in the United States is expensive," she added gently. No self-pity. No dramatic sadness. Just a simple sentence carrying years of sacrifice inside it. Ethan looked down at the tablecloth for a moment, uncomfortable with the realization settling deeper inside him. Earlier that night, he and Victoria had mocked Claire's education while sitting beneath $12,000 worth of jewelry and tailored fabric. Meanwhile, Claire had given up a future most people could only dream about simply to care for someone else. The contrast made his stomach tighten unexpectedly. Daniel Laurent slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them with a folded napkin. "And now you work here." Claire smiled faintly. "Now I work wherever life requires me to work." Camille looked almost emotional hearing that. "Do you miss it?" Claire glanced toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. Neon lights shimmered against the glass like watercolor paint melting into darkness. "France." Camille nodded. Claire thought for a moment before answering. "I miss the mornings." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Claire's expression softened for the first time all evening. The bakeries opening before sunrise. The sound of bicycles on narrow streets. The way people linger over coffee instead of rushing through it. Even Ethan could picture it as she spoke. Her voice carried memory differently than most people. Not dramatic. Intimate. As though she had carefully protected those moments for years and only shared them rarely. Victoria suddenly shifted in her chair. Well, she said too quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle now. At least your French degree finally became useful tonight. Silence followed instantly. Camille's expression cooled. Daniel looked unimpressed. Ethan closed his eyes briefly in embarrassment. But Claire simply turned toward Victoria calmly. Completely calmly. It was always useful, she replied softly. Tonight just made it visible. The sentence landed with devastating grace. No anger. No insult. Just truth spoken gently enough that it hurt more. Victoria's face flushed beneath the chandelier light. Ethan stared at Claire in disbelief again because she had just dismantled his wife's cruelty without raising her voice even once. Daniel Laurent smiled into his wine glass. Camille looked down, hiding a grin. And somewhere near the back of the restaurant, the manager nearly stopped breathing from secondhand tension. Ethan slowly exhaled and rubbed his thumb against the edge of his crystal glass. For the first time in years, he felt intellectually outmatched in a conversation. Not by another billionaire. Not by a rival executive. By the quiet waitress he had dismissed within seconds of seeing her uniform. Claire stepped back from the table again as another course arrived from the kitchen. Her movements remained graceful, controlled, almost invisible beneath the golden lights and soft piano music. But Ethan understood something now that unsettled him deeply. Claire Bennett had never been invisible at all. He had simply failed to look closely enough. By the time dessert arrived, the storm outside had grown heavier. Rain hammered softly against the windows while distant headlights smeared across the wet Manhattan streets below like rivers of gold. Inside looked Claremont. However, the atmosphere around Ethan Whitmore's table had become strangely intimate. Not relaxed. Not comfortable. Just honest in a way Ethan had not expected when he entered the restaurant that evening. Claire stood near the edge of the table, translating another exchange between Daniel Laurent and Ethan while the scent of espresso and warm chocolate drifted through the dining room. Her voice remained smooth and measured, effortlessly carrying meaning between two worlds without ever drawing attention to herself. Yet everyone listened when she spoke. Daniel eventually set his coffee cup down onto the saucer with deliberate care. I believe, he said in English now, his accent calm but firm, that tonight would have ended very differently without Miss Bennett. Ethan looked toward Claire immediately. She lowered her eyes slightly, as if hoping the attention would pass over her. It did not. You saved a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Daniel continued. And more importantly, you prevented unnecessary disrespect between two companies. Ethan swallowed quietly. Hearing it stated aloud made his earlier behavior feel even smaller somehow. Claire, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. Victoria shifted uncomfortably beside him. Claire remained still. Ethan exhaled once before continuing. When we arrived tonight, I judged you immediately. The words felt unnatural in his mouth. Men like Ethan Whitmore rarely admitted fault publicly. I assumed your uniform told me everything I needed to know about you. Claire said nothing. Her silence forced him to continue honestly. I was wrong. Around them, nearby conversations softened again as diners subtly listened without pretending otherwise. Ethan noticed for the first time how humiliating genuine humility could feel. Not because it weakened him, because it exposed him. Claire finally met his eyes calmly. Most people do the same thing. Ethan frowned slightly. And that does not bother you? A faint smile touched Claire's face. Sadder than amused. It used to. She adjusted a dessert fork near Victoria's untouched plate before continuing softly. Then I realized something important. People who need to underestimate others are usually trying very hard to protect their own sense of importance. Victoria looked down immediately after hearing that. Ethan did not defend himself this time because deep down he knew she was right. Daniel Laurent leaned back slightly, observing Claire with increasing admiration. You speak like someone much older than 27. Claire's expression softened again. Life can age people quietly. Camille looked toward her father before speaking carefully. You know, father still funds an international language fellowship in Lyon. Claire glanced toward her. I heard about that. Camille tilted her head slightly. Former winners are always welcome to return. Ethan looked between them, realizing what Camille was offering without saying directly. An opportunity. A door reopening after years closed. But Claire simply smiled politely. That is generous. Daniel studied her closely. But Claire looked toward the rain outside again. My mother still requires treatment here in New York. Silence followed once more. Heavy. Real. Ethan suddenly remembered the mocking comments from earlier about education and community college and useless degrees. He felt physically uncomfortable now thinking about them, while Claire stood there carrying responsibilities none of them had bothered to imagine. Daniel slowly nodded with understanding. Family first. Claire answered softly. Always. For several moments, nobody spoke. The piano continued quietly in the corner, while waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays beneath warm golden light. Somewhere near the kitchen, glasses clinked softly together. Ordinary sounds. Yet Ethan felt as though the entire evening had shifted into something far more personal than business. He glanced toward Claire again. Earlier, she had seemed invisible to him. Now she felt impossible to ignore. Not because she demanded attention, because she carried dignity without needing permission from anyone in the room. Daniel eventually reached inside his suit jacket and removed a sleek black business card embossed with silver lettering. He placed it gently onto the tablecloth beside Claire's folded order pad. If your circumstances ever change, he said. Calmly, call me directly. Claire looked down at the card but did not immediately touch it. Daniel continued. Women with your abilities should not spend their lives apologizing for rooms too small to recognize them. Ethan felt those words land harder than they should have. Because deep down, he knew Daniel was not only speaking to Claire anymore. He was speaking to everyone at the table who had failed to see her clearly. Claire finally picked up the card carefully. Thank you, monsieur. Daniel smiled faintly. No, thank you. Camille rose from her chair and leaned closer toward Claire before quietly speaking in French. You still think in French before you answer difficult questions. Claire blinked in surprise. Camille smiled knowingly. You used to do that during competitions. For the first time all evening, Claire laughed softly. Genuine laughter. Small. Warm. Human. Ethan stared at her for a moment longer than he intended, because suddenly she no longer looked like someone surviving life quietly beneath restaurant lights. She looked like someone who had once belonged on much larger stages and simply stepped away from them without bitterness. And somehow, that made her even more extraordinary. The dinner finally began winding down close to 10 o'clock. Outside, the rain had softened into a steady silver mist drifting through the Manhattan streets, coating black cars and glowing traffic lights in reflections that looked almost unreal beneath the city haze. Inside Le Claremont, candles burned lower on the tables while the pianist transitioned into slower melodies that floated quietly through the nearly empty restaurant. Daniel Laurent stood first. Thank you for the evening, he said calmly to Ethan while buttoning his tailored charcoal coat. I believe we have the foundation for something productive. Ethan rose immediately and shook his hand, relief visible beneath his composed expression. I appreciate your patience tonight. Daniel glanced briefly toward Claire standing nearby with a tray tucked beneath one arm. Patience had very little to do with it. Ethan understood the meaning instantly. Camille Laurent approached Claire next, smiling warmly now, without any of the distance wealthy strangers often carried. I hope we meet again someday. Claire returned the smile softly. Perhaps in France next time. Camille's eyes brightened. I would like that. Daniel gave Claire one final respectful nod before he and his daughter disappeared beneath the golden entrance lights and into the rainy Manhattan night. For several seconds after the doors closed, silence lingered around Ethan's table. The deal had survived. Barely. And everyone there knew exactly why. Victoria slowly reached for her purse without speaking. Earlier in the evening, she had controlled every conversation effortlessly. Now she seemed smaller somehow beneath the dim chandelier glow. Ethan looked toward Claire as she began clearing empty glasses from the table with her usual calm precision. Claire. She paused politely. Yes, sir. Ethan almost flinched hearing the distance in her voice again. Sir. As though the entire evening had changed nothing between them personally. Maybe it had not. Would you sit with us for a moment? Victoria looked up immediately, surprised by the request. Claire hesitated. I should return to work. Ethan glanced around the restaurant. Nearly every table had emptied. Please. Claire studied him quietly for a second before finally setting the tray down beside the table. She sat carefully across from them, posture straight, hands folded lightly in her lap. Even seated, she carried herself with understated grace that no designer clothing could create. Ethan realized then that confidence and dignity were not the same thing. He had spent most of his life surrounded by confidence. Claire possessed dignity instead, and somehow it felt rarer. I keep replaying earlier tonight in my head, Ethan admitted quietly. The things we said to you. Claire remained calm. People say careless things every day. That does not excuse them. She looked at him for a long moment. Ethan noticed how tired her eyes seemed now beneath the warm lighting. Not physically tired. Life tired. The kind built slowly through responsibility and sacrifice. Victoria finally spoke, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. I really did not mean to humiliate you. Claire turned toward her gently. But you did. The honesty landed softly between them. No accusation. No anger. Somehow that made it worse. Victoria lowered her eyes immediately. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Why did you help me tonight? Claire blinked once. What do you mean? You could have let that deal collapse. His voice dropped lower. After the way we treated you, most people probably would have. Claire considered the question carefully. Maybe. Then why didn't you? She glanced toward the rain outside before answering. Because embarrassment teaches lessons. Ruin usually just creates bitterness. Ethan stared at her in silence. That sentence alone carried more emotional intelligence than most executive leadership seminars he had ever attended. Claire continued softly. You made assumptions about me because of my uniform. That was wrong. But if I had humiliated you publicly in return, I would have been doing the exact same thing. Victoria slowly looked up at her again. How are you this calm? Claire smiled faintly. I was not always. The answer felt heavier than she intended. Ethan noticed it immediately. Someone hurt you. Claire's smile faded slightly. Life does that to everyone eventually. She stood slowly from the chair before either of them could ask more questions. Excuse me for a moment. Ethan watched her walk toward the service station near the kitchen where another waitress quietly handed her a phone. Claire checked the screen, and instantly something changed in her expression. Concern. Real concern. She answered immediately in a softer voice Ethan could barely hear from across the dining room. Mom. Victoria glanced toward Ethan uneasily. Claire listened for several seconds, her free hand pressing lightly against her forehead now. The composed calm she had maintained all evening cracked just slightly around the edges. Ethan stood instinctively without realizing it. Claire ended the call quietly before closing her eyes for one brief moment beside the service counter. Then she straightened her posture again. Professional. Controlled. But Ethan had seen enough. He walked toward her carefully. Is everything all right? Claire quickly placed the phone into her apron pocket. Yes. Ethan recognized the lie immediately because it sounded exactly like the lies successful people told every day when they did not want others seeing weakness. Claire. She exhaled softly. My mother's treatment center called. The restaurant lights reflected faintly against the moisture gathering in her eyes, though she fought hard not to let it show. There was a complication with her medication tonight. Ethan felt his chest tighten unexpectedly as Claire looked down toward the folded white cloth still resting neatly over her arm. Even now, in the middle of personal fear, she still looked composed enough to continue serving tables. And somehow that quiet strength affected him more than anything else he had witnessed all evening. Claire slipped the phone back into her apron pocket with steady hands, but Ethan could still see the tension behind her eyes. The restaurant around them had nearly emptied now. Only a few late-night diners remained beneath the dim golden lights, their quiet conversations blending into the soft piano melody drifting through Luke Claremont like distant rain. Victoria stood slowly from the table, suddenly looking uncertain about where she belonged in the moment. Ethan kept his attention on Claire. Do you need to leave? Claire shook her head automatically. My shift ends in an hour. That was not my question. She hesitated. Ethan noticed how instinctively she prioritized responsibility over herself, even now. The nurses are monitoring her, Claire finally said softly. There is nothing I can do until visiting hours reopen in the morning. Ethan frowned. And you are still planning to finish your shift? Claire gave the smallest shrug. Bills do not usually pause for emergencies. The sentence settled heavily between them. Victoria looked away toward the rain-covered windows. Ethan had spent most of his adult life around people who spoke constantly about ambition, sacrifice, and hard work. Yet standing beside Claire now, all those polished executive speeches suddenly felt performative. Because this woman lived sacrifice quietly every single day without demanding admiration for it. Claire bent slightly to pick up an empty wine glass from a nearby table. Even after everything that evening, she continued working with the same calm professionalism. Ethan watched her for another second before making a decision. You are leaving now. Claire looked up immediately. Excuse me. Your shift is over. Mr. Whitmore, I cannot just leave in the middle of service. Ethan glanced toward the restaurant manager near the bar. I think that problem can be solved. The manager hurried over almost instantly, clearly nervous in Ethan's presence after the high-profile dinner. Is everything all right, sir? Ethan nodded once. Claire is leaving for the evening. Claire immediately shook her head. No, I am not. Ethan ignored her politely. Her mother is in a treatment facility and requires attention tonight. The manager's expression softened with concern. Claire, why didn't you say something? Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Because we were short-staffed. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Even now, she was apologizing for loyalty instead of asking for help. The manager placed a gentle hand near her shoulder. Go. We will handle things here. Claire opened her mouth to protest again, but Ethan interrupted quietly. Please stop acting like carrying everything alone is noble. That caught her off guard. She looked at him carefully then, as though trying to determine whether his concern was genuine or simply guilt dressed as kindness. Ethan held her gaze calmly. You saved my evening tonight. Let someone help you for once. For several seconds, Claire said nothing. Then finally, very softly, I do not know how to be the person who needs help. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest hearing that, because he suddenly understood how long she had been surviving on her own. Victoria stepped forward unexpectedly. Neither do I, she admitted quietly. Claire looked surprised. Victoria offered a small, uncomfortable smile. But I think life forces everyone into that position eventually. It was the most honest thing Victoria had said all night. Claire nodded faintly. The manager disappeared briefly into the office and returned with Claire's coat and bag. Ethan noticed how worn the leather straps looked compared to the luxury surrounding them. Small detail. Important detail. Claire thanked the manager softly before slipping into her charcoal coat near the entrance. Outside the windows, rain continued shimmering beneath streetlights while black umbrellas drifted along Fifth Avenue like shadows. Ethan grabbed his own coat immediately. I will drive you. Claire turned quickly. That is not necessary. Probably not, Ethan admitted. But I would still like to. She hesitated again. Victoria quietly picked up her purse from the table. I will take the car home, she said softly to Ethan. He looked surprised. So did Claire. Victoria met Claire's eyes for a brief moment before speaking carefully. You really did not deserve how I treated you earlier. Claire's expression remained gentle. Thank you for saying that. Victoria swallowed once. You know what the worst part is? Claire tilted her head slightly. Victoria gave a humorless laugh. I actually thought I sounded sophisticated tonight. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. Victoria glanced toward Ethan before stepping closer to Claire. For what it is worth, she said quietly, I think your mother raised someone extraordinary. Claire looked genuinely caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. The compliment seemed to affect her more deeply than the earlier insults ever had. Victoria noticed it too. Go see her, she whispered gently. Claire nodded once. Outside, thunder rolled softly over Manhattan again as Ethan held the restaurant door open for her. Cold rain-scented air drifted inside immediately, carrying the distant sound of traffic and sirens through the city night. Claire paused beneath the doorway lights for one brief second before stepping outside beside Ethan into the silver glow of the storm-covered streets. And for the first time all evening, nobody there saw her as a waitress walking into the rain. They saw a woman carrying far more than anyone had bothered to imagine. Ethan's black Mercedes moved slowly through the rain-covered Manhattan streets, while jazz played softly through the speakers at almost inaudible volume. Outside the windows, neon signs blurred against wet glass, and yellow taxi lights stretched into long ribbons beneath the storm. Claire sat quietly in the passenger seat with both hands folded around her phone, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the city lights. Ethan drove carefully, glancing toward her every few moments without speaking. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Claire finally looked down at the glowing screen in her lap. No new messages. She exhaled softly. The treatment center is on the Upper East Side, she said. Ethan nodded once. I know the area. Rain tapped steadily against the windshield while the wipers moved in slow rhythm through the darkness. Ethan had driven through Manhattan thousands of times before, but tonight the city felt strangely different to him. Quieter somehow. More honest. You really loved France, he said after several minutes. Claire smiled faintly without looking at him. I loved who I was there. Ethan understood immediately that those were not the same thing. Who were you? Claire watched the rain slide across the glass beside her. Someone with plans. The answer stayed with him longer than she probably intended. Ethan loosened one hand from the steering wheel slightly. And now? Claire hesitated. Now I focus on surviving 1 month at a time. There was no self-pity in her voice. That affected him most. She spoke about sacrifice the same way other people spoke about weather, as though enduring it had simply become part of daily life. Ethan turned onto Park Avenue, where luxury buildings rose into the rainy night like glowing towers of glass and stone. You know, he said quietly, most people at my level spend their lives trying to appear impressive. Claire finally looked toward him. And does it work? Ethan gave a small laugh under his breath. Sometimes. Not tonight. The honesty should have embarrassed him. Instead, it made him smile for the first time in hours. No, he admitted. Not tonight. Claire leaned her head lightly against the seat and closed her eyes for a second. Ethan noticed how exhausted she suddenly looked now that the restaurant lights and professional mask were gone. Not weak, just tired in a way that reached deeper than sleep. Can I ask you something? He said carefully. Claire opened her eyes again. You already are. Ethan glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention to the road. Why did you hide it? Hide what? Your education. Your languages. Everything. Claire looked out the window again as they stopped at a red light glowing against the rain. Because intelligence changes the way people treat you. Ethan frowned slightly. Is that a bad thing? Sometimes. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. People become uncomfortable when your reality interrupts the version of you they created in their minds. Ethan felt the truth of that immediately because she had done exactly that to him tonight. So you stayed quiet. Claire nodded softly. Quiet people get underestimated. And that helps. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her lips. More than you would think. The light turned green. Ethan drove forward slowly while her words echoed in his mind. Quiet people get underestimated. He realized then that Claire Bennett had likely spent years allowing arrogant people to expose themselves freely simply because they assumed she was powerless. There was strength in that kind of silence. Dangerous strength. You could have destroyed me tonight, Ethan admitted after a while. Claire looked confused. At the restaurant, he tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. When Daniel misunderstood me, you could have stood there and watched everything collapse. Claire studied him carefully before answering. Would that have made me better than you? Ethan did not respond immediately because he knew the answer already. The city lights reflected across her face softly as she continued. People think dignity means winning every moment. It does not. Her voice remained calm. Sometimes dignity is choosing not to become cruel when you finally have the chance. Ethan felt something shift uncomfortably inside him hearing that, because no one in his world spoke that way anymore. Everyone around him measured success through leverage, advantage, dominance. Claire measured people differently. The Mercedes finally pulled beneath the covered entrance of a private medical building glowing softly against the rain. Nurses moved behind tall glass windows inside, while muted lobby lights reflected across the wet pavement outside. Claire stared at the entrance for one long second before quietly reaching for the door handle. Thank you for the ride. Ethan turned off the engine. I will walk you in. You do not have to. I know. Claire looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. The arrogant executive from earlier that evening seemed farther away now somehow, dissolved somewhere between rainstorms and difficult truths. Ethan met her gaze steadily. You spent all night protecting my dignity, he said quietly. Allow me to protect yours for 5 minutes. Claire's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then she gave the smallest nod. Together they stepped out beneath the rain-covered city lights while cold air swept through the street around them. And as Ethan walked beside her toward the hospital entrance, he realized something he had never understood before. Some people carry intelligence loudly because they need recognition. But the rarest people carry it quietly because they no longer need permission to know their own worth. The lobby of the treatment center smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic beneath the soft glow of recessed lights. Outside, rain continued drifting down across Manhattan in silver waves, but inside the building everything felt hushed, gentle. The overnight receptionist looked up as Claire and Ethan entered together through the glass doors. "Miss Bennett," she said quietly, recognizing her immediately. Claire stepped forward with concern returning to her face. "How is my mother?" The receptionist offered a reassuring smile. "She is stable now. The medication reaction passed about 20 minutes ago." Claire closed her eyes briefly in relief. Not dramatic relief. The quiet kind that weakened the knees for half a second after holding fear inside too long. Ethan noticed her shoulders finally relax beside him. "You can go up," the receptionist continued softly. "Room 814. Claire thanked her and moved toward the elevator before suddenly stopping. She turned back toward Ethan as though only now remembering he was still there. "You really do not have to wait." Ethan slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat. "I know." Claire studied him for a moment beneath the warm lobby lights. Then, very softly, "Thank you anyway." The elevator ride to the 8th floor passed mostly in silence except for the faint hum of machinery and distant rain against the building windows. Claire stared at the glowing floor numbers while Ethan stood beside her quietly, unsure why leaving suddenly felt impossible. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped into a dim hallway lined with soft lamps and muted carpeting. Nurses moved calmly between rooms while monitors beeped faintly in the distance. Claire slowed near room 814 before carefully pushing the door open. Her mother slept peacefully beneath pale hospital blankets. Silver hair spread gently across the pillow while city lights shimmered through the rain-streaked window behind her bed. Claire exhaled slowly at the sight of her. Ethan remained near the doorway, suddenly feeling like an outsider witnessing something deeply personal. Claire stepped quietly beside the bed and adjusted the blanket near her mother's shoulder with practiced tenderness. "She used to teach music," Claire whispered after a while without turning around. Ethan looked toward the sleeping woman. "Piano." Claire nodded faintly. "Elementary school, children mostly." A small smile touched her lips. She believed every child deserved to learn something beautiful. Ethan glanced around the modest room. A worn paperback novel rested beside the bed along with an old pair of reading glasses and a small framed photograph of Claire standing beside an upright piano years earlier in front of a narrow stone building somewhere in France. Ethan slowly walked closer to the picture. Claire noticed. "Lion," she said softly. "The summer before she became sick." Ethan studied the younger version of Claire in the photo, smiling openly. Shoulders lighter somehow. "You looked happy." Claire looked toward the picture too. "I was." Silence settled gently between them. Then Ethan asked the question he had been carrying. "All night. Do you regret coming home?" Claire did not answer immediately. She sat carefully beside her mother's bed and took her hand gently between both of hers. "Every life costs something," she said finally. "Mine just cost a different future than I expected." Ethan felt those words deeply because for the first time in years he realized how privileged he had been to pursue ambition without sacrifice demanding payment elsewhere. Claire looked up at him then. "But no," she added quietly. "I do not regret choosing her." Ethan nodded slowly. Somehow he had expected that answer already. A soft voice suddenly interrupted from the bed. "Claire." Her mother's eyes opened weakly beneath the dim light. Claire's face transformed instantly. Warmth. Relief. Love without restraint. "Hey, Mom." Her mother smiled faintly before noticing Ethan standing nearby. "Oh." Claire squeezed her hand gently. "This is Ethan." Her mother looked between them with tired but intelligent eyes. "The one from the restaurant." Ethan blinked in surprise. Claire laughed softly under her breath. News travels fast among nurses apparently. Her mother studied Ethan for a second before smiling knowingly. "You look less arrogant than I imagined." Ethan actually laughed then. Genuine laughter. Quiet but real. Claire stared at him briefly, almost surprised by the sound. Her mother's gaze shifted toward Claire again. "Did you finally let someone help you?" Claire lowered her eyes slightly. "Maybe a little." Her mother smiled weakly. "Good." Ethan stood there watching them together while rain shimmered softly beyond the hospital window and something inside him settled into clarity for the first time in years. All evening he had believed Claire Bennett's greatest quality was intelligence, or grace, or composure under humiliation. But standing in that quiet hospital room, he understood the truth. Her greatest strength was love carried without bitterness. Even after sacrifice, even after disappointment, Claire gently brushed a strand of silver hair away from her mother's forehead before looking back toward Ethan near the doorway. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. They did not need to, because some moments become too honest for language. Outside, Manhattan continued glowing through the rain like a restless kingdom of glass and ambition. But inside room 814, beneath soft hospital lights and quiet breathing, Ethan Whitmore finally understood something wealth had never managed to teach him. The rarest people in the world are not the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones who quietly carry pain, responsibility, kindness, and dignity all at once without asking anyone to notice. And sometimes, the people others overlook are already extraordinary long before the world finally learns how to see